Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, 104 Years Since the Balfour Declaration, Fighting Anti-Zionism, Debunking the Occupation Lie. My name is Agnes Imani. I'm the newly appointed Chief Administrative Officer at Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights and your host today. I would like to thank the attendees who took the time to join us today, as well as the over 700 registrants and 34 co-sponsors. We are overjoyed by the amount of interest this has stirred up. We would like to welcome our exceptional panelists, Andrew Tucker, Tomas Sandell, Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, Itamar Marcus, and Dan Illouz. We would also like to welcome our moderators, Goldi Steiner, founder and co-chair of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, Irving Weisdorf, co-chair, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, and Doug Altabef, Im-Tirtzu, chairman of the board. Due to the importance of today's topic and the number of exceptional panelists, it's not likely that we'll have time to hold a Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please submit your questions by email to agnes@israelslegalrights.org with CC to goldi@israelslegalrights.org, or submit them in the Q&A chat window, and we will try our best to get your questions answered in our next bulletin. The mentioned emails will be brought up on the screen and in the chat window at the end of our webinar, along with important video links and a link to purchase our book. Now, I would like to call on Goldi Steiner, founder and co-chair of Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, to present her opening remarks. Take it away, Goldi.
Thank you, Agnes, and I second all your beautiful welcoming words to the audience. I also want to thank our co-sponsors and especially those who have promoted our webinar. Hello, everyone. My name is Goldi Steiner. About today's webinar, it is a juxtaposition of the indigenous Jewish people's legal rights to the land from the river to the sea versus Israel haters who fight using weapons of lies, distortion, and delusion, claiming that Israel occupies her own historic and legal land. We are fortunate to be joined by an illustrious roster of panelists, world-renowned experts in the field of international law, asserting Israel's rights, and also speakers devoted to expose the deniers, guiding us to find some solutions to the debunking of the occupation and other lies. Half the solution lies in understanding the problems we are faced with, and part of the other half is in the hands of all truth-loving people whom we ask to spread the facts and truth exponentially. There is strength in numbers. Numbers of people can speak to power, they speak to authorities and their governments, where one day we firmly believe that change will come. Lies will tumble by their sheer weight. About Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, known as CIRL, our mission statement: we Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights are dedicated to educating Israeli and Jewish diaspora youth, as well as the public at large, including the international community, about Israel's legal rights to the land of Israel under international law. CIRL was founded in 2009 by the late Solomon Ben Zimra and myself, and as fortune has it today, we are joined by Irving Weisdorf, co-chair of our organization. In 2010, we joined the European Coalition for Israel, directed by Tomas Sandell, one of our distinguished speakers today for the first San Remo commemoration. In 2018, we entered into partnership with Im-Tirtzu, Israel's foremost Zionist organization, and work hand in hand with their entire team, and particularly with our much valued co-strategist, Eitan Meir, who today is absent because he's serving in the reserve, IDF reserves. Our partnership is akin to marriage made in heaven. And with no further ado, I call on Doug Altabef, chairman of the board of Im-Tirtzu, who will speak for himself and who will be introducing and moderating our first cherished panelist, Andrew Tucker. To you, Doug.
Thank you, Goldi, and thank you everyone for joining us. I I know there have been some comments here about volume control, so I will try to speak a bit louder, which is not difficult since I'm a native of the Bronx. But I want to first start off by expressing the delight that we at IMTIR2, as Goldi mentioned, IMTIR2 is the largest grassroots Zionist organization in Israel. And this is now going on our 4th year of partnership with CIRL. And as Goldi aptly put it, it is a marriage made in heaven. Why? Because the two organizations share a similar vision and a similar love of Israel, of Zionism, a concern to maintain a proud, just, humane, decent Jewish state in Israel. And we are both big believers in education, big believers in providing information to people, speaking up to people, not speaking down to them. And I think that the quality of the roster of our panelists today is a very, very good indication of that. CIRL comes with critical distance coming from Canada, and IMTIR2 comes with critical energy here in Israel with on-the-ground activism. And it's a wonderful, wonderful combination. Tonight is just one of several of the panels that we have put together, the presentations we have put together, and please God, it will be just one, a prelude to many more that we will do in the future. So having said that, I have the really distinct pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Andrew Tucker, who has spent a great deal of time in his life being a vital bridge between the Christian world and the Jewish world, between the Christian world and the state of Israel. He has performed, Andrew, if I might say, some really significant mitzvot, and he has a rather strong and impressive resume of having edited publications. Specifically, he was the former executive director of Christians for Israel International. He's now the editor-in-chief of Israel and Christians Today, co-founder of the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. But what I find most impressive about him is that he has been a kind, just voice seeking to create understanding between the Christian world and the Jewish world. So with that, Andrew, what I want to do is to start by asking you, let's put aside, obviously, the Bible, which for you and I and most of us is, of course, the original, essential, the irreplaceable source of the connection of the Jewish people and the land of Israel and the legitimacy of our sovereignty here. But putting that aside, it seems to me that Balfour stands as a historic game changer. It is really marks the first time that a major world power, arguably the world power at the time that it was issued, puts its imprimatur on the idea of creating a Jewish homeland. So before we examine the significance of Balfour, I'd like you to provide a little bit of context. And this is really a two-part question because it's both national context, national and political context, but it's also personal context because of the very strong Christian Zionist inclinations and values and beliefs of not only Lord Balfour, but of Prime Minister Lloyd George, under whom he served. So can you paint a little bit of a picture for us of where Balfour stands historically? Hopefully talk as loud as me.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Thank you, Goldi and Irving and the whole team there for this wonderful event and for the invitation to speak. I'm honored to do so. And I feel a little inequipped seeing the panel that we have. I'll do my best. Perhaps just by way of a little background to explain how I connect with this, because I see certain threads coming together. There's a political aspect to it. There's a religious or spiritual aspect to the Balfour Declaration and a legal aspect. And I think in all three, what happened on the 31st of October, 1917 was a watershed historically in all areas. I'm an Australian by birth. I grew up in Australia. I live in the Netherlands, which apparently hosts The Hague, being the international legal capital of the world. I'm a Christian. I grew up amongst Jews in Melbourne, which has a very strong Jewish community. But I only came much later in life to come to some understanding of the significance of Israel. Like many Christians, I was brought up with a kind of latent supersessionist theology. And that is, I basically thought and believed that the church had replaced Israel as God's people. That's the way most Christians look at the world. They might love the Jewish people and think the Jewish people have a right to a national existence. But from a biblical perspective, the church has become the people of God, and there's very little place in that history of salvation for the Jewish people. And I want to come back to that in a moment, because I believe what Balfour and others did at that moment was truly revolutionary. There's a legal aspect as well. And as an international lawyer, this is what fascinates me about Balfour. And I'm happy to speak about it, but I find where I'm wrestling to understand why the international legal community is so opposed today, and it is, we'll talk more about it, to the idea of what was decided at Balfour, namely the reconstitution of the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And I think there are different reasons for why that is the case. Balfour himself was a Christian, as was Lloyd George, the Prime Minister at the time. Balfour comes from the British elite. He was in fact Prime Minister earlier in the century. Well connected. He would be what we would describe today as a Christian evangelical. And let me up front dispel perhaps a little bit the impression that might be out there that Christian evangelicals are all today in the United States. That's where the Christian evangelical world is. Well, I can tell you it's not. There are many, what we would call evangelicals in quotation marks, Christians who understand the significance of Israel and the Jewish people in many countries around the world. They're just perhaps less visible than they are in the United States. And I think part of the work that we've been trying to do, and Thomas as well and others, is to give them a platform and a voice to express their commitment to Israel and the Jewish people, even in a political sense. So Balfour was a Christian. Now, something remarkable happened in the 19th century in the United Kingdom, particularly, and it really happened after the French Revolution. And that is that we had the Protestants who'd sort of turned away from Catholicism and turned back to the Bible in the 16th and 17th century. We'd had revivals in the Christian world. But after the French Revolution, something happened, and that was that Christian students of the Bible started to really study the prophetic words of the Old Testament, or we consider the Old Testament, in a serious way. And they were picking up on writings that had already happened in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in the Puritans, and they understood or believed that they understood that God's purposes and covenant intentions with Israel and the Jewish people are eternal and irrevocable. That is, God doesn't turn away from what he promises. And that is revolutionary from a Christian perspective. If you come from a perspective that the church has replaced Israel as being God's people, then this idea cuts at the very heart of what it means to be a Christian. And this became, never became wholly mainstream in the United Kingdom. And sadly today, it's a very, very small minority which hold this view. But at the time of Balfour, in this very unique period of the decade, really, of the first and second decades of the 20th century, we had in the British cabinet a number, particularly two of them, Balfour himself as Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister himself, Lloyd George, who were fully committed to this idea that God is faithful to the Jewish people and that Britain has a certain special responsibility towards them. And I think this played very much into the sympathy that they had for Zionism as it began to take form under Herzl in the last decades of the 19th century into the 20th century, and the growing interrelationship between the Zionist movement and the political elite. And Balfour was an absolutely key figure in that. Not the only one. His name is on the resolution. He didn't write it. It was, and I'll explain in a moment just how it came into being, a little more detail, but he was clearly instrumental in the decision on the afternoon of the 31st of October to issue this declaration and the letter that was sent on the 2nd of November to Lord Rothschild with the British promise to do its best to make sure that the Jewish people will have a homeland in Palestine. That's a long answer to a short question.
So to what extent is the declaration not only significant in and of itself, but also significant as, say, the first domino leading to further progress, to further encapsulations of the incidence of sovereignty? Does the rest of the world see, obviously for the Zionist movement, Balfour is, of dramatic, game-changing significance. Does the rest of the world see it that way? And does it follow suit in the vision that Lord Balfour presented?
The answer, Doug, is no. The world doesn't see it. I think we have to understand that at the beginning of the 20th century, we were moving from an age of empires into an age of nation states. So we had the nation states of Europe, which all had their empires. The British Empire, the French had their empires, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish. We had the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the Russians, of course, trying to expand their influence as well. But what happened in the middle and at the end of the First World War was and again, it's a watershed between the age of empire into the age of nation states. So whereas we had like 50 nation states at the end of the First World War establishing the League of Nations, we now have 4 times that number, almost 200 members of the United Nations. So the 20th century has been a revolution in the creation of nation states. That wasn't the case at the time of Balfour. Let me just quote something. I'd like to just quote from the words that are outside the United Nations building in New York, and they're taken from Isaiah chapter 2, because I think it says an awful lot about the way the world looks today at all of this. And the words are taken from the very first verses of Isaiah chapter 2. They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war any war. Okay, so that's a vision of peace. Nations are not fighting wars anymore. After the Second World War, the United Nations was created to end conflict, basically. Now, what of course they miss there are the preceding words of Isaiah, where the Lord talks about this peace will come one day, but first of all, Jerusalem has to be reestablished. Zion has to be established, and the word and the law of the Lord will go forth from Zion. And to me, the Balfour Declaration leading to the San Remo Resolution, the mandate for Palestine, was about the restitution of the Jewish nation in what had become known as Palestine. It's a Roman word. Again, the Romans using this language to replace the Jewish connection with the land, but the territory had become known as Palestine. So that's why Balfour Declaration talks of the restoration of the Jewish nation in Palestine. It opened the door for the reconstitution of Zion, of Jerusalem, I think. And Balfour knew this, and Lloyd George knew this. But the world today is not interested in that aspect. You know, I'm constantly grappling with why the world is so furiously angry with Israel for so-called annexation of Jerusalem, which from an international law perspective in 1967 made perfect sense. And there are very good legal arguments why Israel had every right to keep sovereignty over the whole of the city of Jerusalem. But if you look at the UN resolutions, they're full of anger, they're full of a violent kind of dismay that the Jewish people should take it into their heads to take control of Jerusalem, which had become an international city. And still the Roman Catholic Church today wants to see Jerusalem as an international city. The nations have never let go of Jerusalem. So there is a spirit, I think, today. International law has changed 180 degrees since the time of Balfour. At the time of Balfour, it was emerging from, as I say, empires, and it was the beginning of a concept of self-determination, which President Wilson of the United States was very keen to bring into play. And that was what underlay the mandate system. So the whole idea of Jewish nationhood was about the Jewish self-determination in Palestine and the connection between a people and a land. This was new, totally new. There was no legal precedent for it. And I believe that the mandate for Palestine is unique amongst the mandates for identifying the specific people and the very specific territory to which it is attached. All of the other mandates, like for Mesopotamia and for Syria, are much more general, and they don't speak about individual peoples as the mandate for Palestine does. So this was, again, totally revolutionary. But it goes against the spirit of today, where the world is not interested in nation states. We've gone through 100 years from self-determination into the creation of new states, but now even the concept of a state is in question. The spirit of the international legal community is to undermine states now and to talk about the human rights of the individual. And therefore, the human rights of the Palestinians has become much more important in world eyes than whatever national rights the Jewish people may have had 100 years ago and may have been expressed in what is seen as an antique document out of a long past, which is no longer relevant.
You know, it's interesting what you're saying, because what I hear you saying is a little bit that Balfour was an abstract concept, an aspirational concept. There was no real meat on the bones in terms of the details of it, because the details would end up, and Maurice and I will talk about this in a little bit, but the details will end up becoming rather difficult, rather messy, rather objectionable. And this becomes, so Balfour stands on a certain aspirational abstract level without the fine tuning. But to your point about how this mandate is different, why is this mandate different from all other mandates? Am I right in suggesting that Balfour is unique in the annals of nation state building, that there really has never been another document like that where one superpower says, we're going to take this people and put it back into this land and work to give that people that sovereignty in that land. Is that am I right about that?
I believe it is unique. I believe it is unique, Doug. And you're absolutely right about the Balfour Declaration itself it's a very vague document, and it's a compromised text, like a lot of these texts. It was a result of over 6 months of detailed coming and going between the Zionists and the different, bearing in mind that many in the Jewish community in the UK at the time were opposed to Zionism in this way. They were opposed to the idea of Jewish nationality. They wanted to be secure in their Jewishness within the nation states. So there were strong voices within the Jewish community, even within the government, opposed to the recreation of Jewish nationality. And then there was the political dimension of the British negotiating with the French, and they wanted to keep the Russians on board. So Balfour went off to Russia, I think in April 1917, to negotiate with the Russians. They were negotiating with the Americans. So all of this played into the draft of the resolution as it came into being. So it speaks, speaking of, for example, a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, specifically not saying an earlier draft said a reconstitution of the Jewish homeland that was rejected because some felt it to be too strong. That Palestine had to be reconstituted as the Jewish homeland was also rejected as being too strong. So in a typically English and British way, it was left in a very ambiguous terminology, and it was left to the later negotiations after the war had been completed. Let's not forget, in November 2017, the war still had another year to go. Nobody knew how this thing was going to end. They didn't know if they were going to defeat the Turks. They didn't know how the Turks would respond to all of this. So it was ambitious. Even despite its ambiguity, it was extremely ambitious. And I think, again, Balfour was the one who made sure that at the meeting on the 31st of October, where opposition was expressed to it, nevertheless, the document was produced. And it was in San Remo that the decision was made to create a mandate, the League of Nations having been created. But then the borders had to be determined. And that also came later. So there was the whole discussion about what are the borders of Palestine. And I believe Lord George was the one who came with the Dan to Beersheba concept, biblical concept in San Remo, which was later implemented in a series of agreements formulating and legally defining the boundaries of the mandate for Palestine. And then it was the mandate itself which gave teeth to this concept by giving a right to the Jewish people to immigrate, giving them a right to close settlement in the territory of Palestine, and creating the Jewish agency, amongst other things. So really putting hands and feet on this concept.
Well, Andrew, in the best tradition of show business, you're leaving them asking for more. And you've given us a great introduction. You've given us a lot of things to think about. We do have an all-star array, and I think in the interest of keeping on some schedule, we'll cut it short there. But I think that you've given us a lot to think about. You've given a tremendous sense of not only the context, but the magnitude, and in effect, the lost magnitude, what was and what we'll talk about now, as we go forward, what has become the legacy of Balfour. But it's a tremendous achievement, and you've given us a very good flavor of it. At this point, So I think I'm going to hand it over to Goldi and we'll keep moving along. So Andrew, thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. And now I will introduce you to Tomas Sandell, who in fact will talk about the indisputable fact that the Balfour Declaration basically is the genesis of one of the three pillars, legal pillars, on which Israel stands. And now I will address Tomas Sandell. Hello, Tomas. Nice seeing you after all those many years. First, a short bio. Tomas Sandell is the founding director of the European Coalition for Israel, and he is also involved with the United Nations through the ECI's Forum for Cultural Diplomacy. He's a former political affairs journalist who has been accredited to the European Union in Brussels. Tomas, I have two questions to you, but the first is, could you please elaborate on the San Remo resolution, how the Balfour Declaration became a legal document and its historical importance? And please provide the audience with the tools how to best communicate the legal implications of the Balfour Declaration to the international community.
Thank you, Goldi, and thank you to the hosts and the panelists. So good to see you, Goldi, again. It's been a few years since we met in Toronto, and more epically 11 years since we met in San Remo and made history together. And Itamar, it's good to see you. We have worked together. And of course, Andrew, who has worked with us for many years as a legal counsel and continues to do amazing work. So let me first say that I'm not an international lawyer. I think all of us here are indebted to a particular Canadian, again, for understanding the significance of the San Remo resolution, speaking, of course, about Jacques Gauthier. Perhaps he is even on this call. If so, you have done an amazing work. And we are all disciples in one way or another to Jacques. And I think we should also mention others like Howard Grieve and Solomon Zimra, of course, who have really carried this torch. So let me answer your question rather shortly. And in my business, when we speak with politicians, it means that every explanation needs to be under 2 minutes. So we don't have the luxury of taking 5 or 10 or 15 minutes and expect to get their attention. But so what we would say often is that as important as the Balfour Declaration was and is, as much as it was a game changer, it did not create international law. And I think this was the first lesson that we learned some 11, 12 years ago, because in the past, I think the narrative of the Jewish state was perhaps lacking some credibility because we would always go back to the Balfour Declaration. But in international law, one state cannot create international law. So what happened, and that's where you mentioned these 3 steps, and you are of course referring to what happened in London in 1917, and then in San Remo in 1920, and later on in London when the Mandate for Palestine was codified. So what makes the San Remo resolution so central is that it was in San Remo in April 1920 that for the first time since the exile, that the international community acknowledged the right of self-determination of the Jewish people in what was then called Palestine. It had never been done before in an international community or international law context. And you may ask yourself the question, well, why has this not played a more important role in the history books of the Jewish state or the modern state of Israel. And I think that's a question that deserves a lot more attention that we can give today in this webinar. And this is also why I will, after having tried to explain this question quite shortly and simply, to get back to the question of how we convey this message to the international community. But just to reiterate, to say what started in London with the Balfour Declaration, then came to a climax in San Remo, Italy, and was then codified into international law with the Mandate for Palestine in 1922. Some would perhaps then add to that development as well the UN Partition Plan, which I often say that Israel is the most legal of all the UN member states, because the right of self-determination has been acknowledged twice by the international community, once by the League of Nations unanimously, I may add, and then by the UN General Assembly in 1947. So I think that is something that international lawyers like Andrew Tucker or Jacques Gauthier would take a good 2 hours to explain more in detail. But I think for our cause today, it is sufficient. It raises a lot of questions. One, and I should add this also to say that the European Coalition for Israel is something as unique as not being neither Israeli nor Jewish, and not even an American organization. And this also gives us, I think, both a responsibility, but also a particular position to speak on these issues, because we are not considered to speak out of self-interest. And we are addressing these issues in some of the most difficult environments in the world. You mentioned the United Nations in New York, where we have been active for the last 10 years. We started in the European Union in Brussels, and last week I was in the Vatican in Rome. Next week, by the way, I'm going to Berlin. But why has this not been more central in the work of the Israeli Foreign Ministry? I have had discussions with members of parliaments who have accepted the message of the San Remo resolution, and then they ask, but wait a minute, when I speak with the ambassador, he refers to these territories not as disputed, but as occupied. And that puts Gentiles, non-Jews, non-Israelis who want to defend the Israeli state in a bit of an awkward situation. Secondly, I think a lot more could be done by the established Jewish organizations around the world who have a voice and who have a platform which is much larger than the ones that we have. I know most of those leaders, so I don't want to put the blame on anyone, but I think there's a lot more work to be done so that this message can come consistently both from the Israeli government, but also from all serious existing Jewish organizations. I think for us at CCI, let me mention to say that as much as this is a legal case, I think today, in this day and age, you hear much more about storytelling. So if we are to ask the question, how do we win the hearts and minds of the young college students in North America, which are going increasingly anti-Israel, we have to break down the narrative of Israel's legal rights in what for me would become universal principles that I think that we can derive out of this message. And There are a few that I'd like to just underline, and I'm sure others will come back to them. When we have today the accusation, first of all, that Israel is a state that is constantly breaking international law, we have to remember the immense failure of the international community not to carry through the obligations under the mandate of Palestine to create a Jewish state in time. And I always make this point when I speak on the International Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 27th of January. And I just made a speech recently where I said that there is less than 3 months between the 2nd of November and the 27th of January, but most speeches in Europe would never make the connection. The facts, of course, are as clear as they are tragic. If there had been a Jewish state in 1938, as I believe was the intention of those who signed the San Remo resolution, hundreds of thousands of Jews would have survived the Shoah. But it was the failure, again, of the international community to live up to their own commitments that caused this enormous tragedy. And I think as a talking point, again, it's important for us that we connect the dots and that we make this very clear that no, Israel is a law-abiding UN member state. It's the international community that time and time again has let down the Jewish people. We speak often about, or Israel is accused of being an apartheid state, a racist state, a colonial endeavor. Again, if we go back to the text of the Mandate for Palestine, we see the complete opposite. We see, and I have the text here in front of me, stating that, that the Jewish people are the indigenous people of the land with a connection of 3,000 years between the land and the people. And it's interesting to note, as a European coalition, today we are an international coalition, we just formed an indigenous coalition for Israel. So meaning that indigenous people groups around the world are coming together to make this same statement. And again, the messaging is clear. Sometimes it's not so much what is being said, but who is saying what. And I think that indigenous groups around the world who can make this legal argument are in a very strong position of convey something very important. I used to say that the creation, the reconstitution of the Jewish state in Palestine meant that, it was the beginning of the decolonization process around the world. So what we saw in Africa starting in the 50s was, of course, that these indigenous people groups of the, it's of course a bit more complicated in Africa, but the principle as such was an encouragement to say that, no, we don't have to accept colonization. We can ask for self-determination. It worked in Israel after having been expelled and stateless for 1,800 years. They could reconstitute themselves. This became a great inspiration around the world. And we should reclaim this narrative when we speak with progressives and when we speak about colonizations. Go back to what happened in San Remo and take back the narrative and do not let anyone accuse Israel of being colonial. Tell me, Goldi, if you want to interrupt or.
Okay, Thomas, thank you very much for those precious, informative words. I told you I have a second question to you, which is asking you for support. Basically, what you're saying, the sad part of our situation is that successive Israeli governments have never made it clear that we have legal rights to the land. Therefore, in 2020, CIRL has made a plea to the government of Israel to declare Yom San Remo as a national holiday. We ask for your support. We have a long list of supporters, among them Eugene Kontorovich and other people who have supported this. We're going to repeat the plea to this existing government as soon as it becomes a stable government, more stable government. In the meantime, we will appreciate your support for this. But for the audience sake, we will have a link at the end of the webinar to the plea that we have made to the government. The bill has been introduced to the Knesset by MK Uzi Dayan, which has been read once, but it came to a stop because of the change in the government. But we're still going to reissue that plea to the government when it becomes more stable, like I said. Could we have your support, please? As well as the audience, you're welcome to send us an email with your support.
Thank you, Goldi. And before I answer your question, let us just reiterate, and I mentioned it initially, that what happened in 2010 was so extremely important. And you, Goldi, you're a star for persevering and despite the ash clouds coming over to San Remo with Salomon and with your wonderful delegation from Toronto to commemorate for the first time in history the San Remo resolution. And you remember that there was a young Israeli Knesset member at the time who came and he got the message. He got very excited. This is Danny Danon, later to become the Israeli permanent representative to the United Nations. And I spoke with him just last week, and who is a great ally. And I think a lot has happened in the last 11 years. We have to realize that. And also within Israeli establishment and Israeli government circles. Another strong ally that you have is the current Israeli ambassador to Rome, Dror Eidar. I had lunch with him a few days ago in Rome. He has done an amazing work in Italy to bring about knowledge about the special connection between Italy and Israel that relates back to San Remo. And when we did the live broadcast for the 100th anniversary of the San Remo resolution, we had the prime minister at the time, Giuseppe Conte of Italy, who gave a very strong statement to say that one of the seed of what would later become the Israeli olive tree was planted in Italian soil in San Remo. And we had similar statements by personalities like Mike Pompeo, Dominic Raab, Scott Morrison, the list goes on. My point is this: it's one thing when we on this panel agree on what is for us something very clear. We need to get the message to the mainstream, but a lot has been achieved within these last 11 years. And to answer your question, Goldi, of course, I want to support this wonderful initiative. And let us hope that there will be many other ways in which we can really put down the flag, also in San Remo as a birthplace of the Jewish state. And I'm in continuous dialogue with the mayor of San Remo, and they are very interested and proud of their heritage together with the Jewish people. I could go on, but again, bravo to you, Goldi, and to everyone else. And let's hope that these next 10 years will be even more successful, and we will get there.
Like we say, from your mouth to God's ears. Thank you very much, Thomas. It's been a special pleasure seeing you again. And now I call on Doug to please introduce our next panelist.
Thank you, Goldi. Thank you, Thomas, for that very insightful presentation. It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce someone who has been a major contributor to the civic and security life of the state of Israel in various contexts. And I'm talking about my friend, Maurice Hirsch. Maurice spent many years as the head of military prosecution for the IDF in Judea and Samaria, where he was a specialist in international law. And he specialized in keeping tabs on not only the PA, but also in prosecuting terrorists. And more recently, he, with his partner Itamar Marcus, do incredible work at the Palestinian Media Watch, where Maurice is the head of legal affairs. So Maurice, we started to hear the sort of the intimations of trouble in terms of the aftermath of Balfour, and having put it on the table, having presented it. Am I right that it was the British themselves who were the first to start walking it back, even beating the rest of the international community to the table in that regard?
Hi, good evening, Doug. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for everyone for having me. The simple answer to your question, really, Doug, is of course yes. Before I give the wider explanation, I think it's important to address not only the historical side of Balfour and his background, but also to discuss the historical background of what led to the Balfour Declaration in the context of what was happening in Israel at the time. Now, we're not talking about the 4 Jewish cities in Israel that had always had Jewish inhabitants. We're talking more about really the start of the middle of the 19th century, when Jews started coming back to Israel en masse. And then going into the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, really the fighting going on, fighting in inverted commas, obviously, between Rothschild on the one hand, building new settlements in Israel for the Jewish population that had come out and made Aliyah to Israel, and Montefiore on the other side, bringing the Jews out of the walls of the old city, spreading out into far off Machane Yehuda. Already starting in 1897, there were Jews spreading out all around Jerusalem, and that context is very important to understand. It isn't correct in any way, shape, or form to say that Balfour came around and only then did the Jews start coming back to Israel. That's simply not true. There had been a massive movement of Jewish identity and Jewish nationalism that had started already in Europe. Herzl, obviously, running around, Weizmann, trying to persuade the world that this was the time to provide the Jews with their national homeland. And that really was the culminated with the Balfour Declaration. Now, I have to point out that today is a super important date for the whole context of Balfour, really. So Balfour was the 2nd of November, really just 2 days before. And when Andrew was talking about the 31st of October, it isn't only an important date for the date of signing the declaration itself, but rather the importance of, again, what's happening in the land of Israel. The British forces, Allenby, were moving forward. The 31st of October is really the culmination of the battle for Beersheba. The British forces are moving in and taking control. On the 14th of November, 1917, the British forces really overcome the Ottomans and send them all the way north in the battle for Nahal Sorek, the Sorek River, which then opens the door to the beginning of December, obviously, when you see remember the famous picture of General Allenby marching in through the Jaffa Gate into the old city. That's about to happen. This is this period of time. It's not only the Balfour Declaration alone in its own vacuum, but really this whole event that's going on around it. That's the Jewish side. The Arab side is much more complex. As Andrew correctly pointed out, the Balfour Declaration was very ambiguous. It set no borders. It recognized the Jewish people's right to the right of self-determination, of having a national homeland, but wasn't specific as to what would that homeland be. The British, as we know, had promised 2 different things to 2 different people. On the one hand, promising Palestine to the Jews, on the one hand, promising a new Arab state to the Arabs. This was the whole context of what was going on. It came on the background of Sykes-Picot the year before, of reorganizing the Middle East. we have to take into account that for 400 years, the Ottomans had been running this area. Palestine wasn't a separate country. It wasn't an independent country. It was just another district of the Ottoman Empire. And to that extent, the Balfour Declaration came along and said, you know what, once we're taking apart the whole Middle East and we're recognizing the rights of all the different people and we're really setting apart the different countries, we're going to find a place also for the Jewish people. Already from that time, it was something which was unacceptable to our Arab neighbors. And really the British start understanding that whilst they would like to see the implementation of the Balfour Declaration, there are tremendous pitfalls on the way. They don't really care about San Remo and the acceptance of the Balfour Declaration by the entire international community. They are less bothered about even about the mandate, which if you haven't read the mandate, if anyone listening hasn't read the mandate for Palestine, it's one of those documents that you have to read as a Zionist, because it talks about recognizing the historical Jewish connection to the land of Israel, reconstituting the Jewish homeland, not creating it anew, but reconstituting the Jewish homeland, something that already existed, and you're now remaking that homeland. That is important. Now, the Arabs obviously had a problem with that, and already we see the British responding to the Arab response. What is the Arab response? The Arab response first comes about in 1929. In 1929, Jews are praying on the 9th of Av by the Kotel, and that starts off the wave of massacres in Hebron, 67 people, in Jerusalem, in Sfat. That's really the first major Arab response in the way that the Arab population responded at the time. There's negotiations, there's discussion, there's agreement of the international community, and then there's the response of the violent response of the Arab population. And then you first have the creation of the Shore Committee. The Shore Committee was set up to investigate the 1929 massacres, and already there you have to, again, read the document and see some of the amazing things that this document has as the first step into trying to roll back the Balfour Declaration. Now, what are we talking about already by 1929? Then we're already talking about the situation where Jordan had already been created. We already had what some people would refer to today as the two-state solution. Jordan, on the one hand, as the Arab state, and Israel as the other state. And now comes along the Shore Committee. And listen to just one of the paragraphs from the Shore Committee. Viewed in the light of the history of at least 6 centuries, Palestine is an artificial conception. Under the Ottoman regime, it formed only part of the administrative unit. Its frontiers are largely artificial. He gives here the background to the fact that there was no idea of Palestine as an independent country. Unfortunately, the promising start to the Shore Committee doesn't continue on. The Shore Committee basically concludes with the understanding that the response to the Balfour Declaration, the Arab response to the Balfour Declaration, is violence and murder. And what we need to do as the British Empire is to reconsider our acceptance of and implementation of the Balfour Declaration. We need to reconsider the fact that by 1929, 2 of the main issues that are identified by the Shore Committee as sparks for the Arab violence. Spark number 1, Jews had been buying too much land in Israel. Now, again, what are we discussing? The implementation of the Balfour Declaration. We're not talking about colonialism where you're bringing in foreigners, you're taking and really nationalizing the land and then giving it away. We're talking about Jews coming in and buying land. That was already a problem for the Arabs in 1929. The other problem, Jewish immigration. If in 1922 there were 87,000 Jews living in Israel, by 1929 there were already 160,000 Jews. The percentage of the population had grown from under 8% to just over 15%. and it was growing all the time. This was the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. Jews reconstituting their national homeland by buying property and moving to live in Israel. That was the idea, unacceptable to the Arabs. That obviously developed into the Peel Commission, and that first idea of, well, we've had the two-state solution. What we would now like to see and implement is the three-state solution. We're going to take the extra set of land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea and divide that into two. What does the Peel Commission come in response to? Again, another round of the Arab revolts in 1936. The more the Arabs were violent and murdered Jews, the more the British rolled back their idea and their desire to implement the Balfour Declaration. And really that has continued on. It started with the British, whether it had been the Shaw Committee, moving on to the Peel Committee. And yes, so that's the somewhat longer answer to your question, Doug. The British really are responsible for the idea of rolling back the idea of implementing Balfour to create a Jewish homeland between the Mediterranean Sea and between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea.
Well, really what you're also pointing out, Maurice, is that just as Andrew and I talked about the sort of the ambiguous, the abstract, the aspirational nature of Balfour on the Jewish side, what you're pointing out is that on the Arab side, this was not abstract, this was not ambiguous, this was absolutely obstinate. This was very clear-cut denial, refusal, and objection to the idea of a Jewish state. And it's interesting when you throw out these percentages, 8 going up to 15, it wasn't 8 going up to 82 or 8 going up to 49. It's an incremental change in the Jewish population, but it is enough to trigger tremendous rejectionism. And in that sense, what you're really telling us is that the reaction to Balfour, whether the British were reacting to the obstinacy of the Arabs, but the reaction to Balfour is really like a microcosm of the reaction to Israel today. The themes have not changed a great deal over the last 100+ years. The themes of we can't accept, we can't live with, these are we can't tolerate this Jewish presence have really not changed. If anything, they've intensified over the last 100. Wouldn't you say?
That's quite right, Doug. The idea of Balfour, if we take it as the abstract, was that, as Andrew said, and also as Thomas said, was the recognition of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. Once you're creating countries and really dividing up the Middle East into new borders and new institutions and new nation states, one of those nation states is the Jewish homeland. And when you attack Balfour, what you're really saying is that you do not accept the right of the Jewish people to a national homeland. Because in the wider context that you're seeing, you cannot just see Balfour as just one decision made in a complete vacuum, just regarding the Jewish people and dispossessing the Arab. What you're really seeing is reorganization of the entire Middle East. And when you focus solely on rejecting the Balfour Declaration and the right of the Jewish people to establish their national homeland, what you're really saying is that we accept everything else that's going around. We accept the creation of Lebanon, really what as they say in Hebrew, yesh me'ayin, from nothing. We accept the creation of Syria. We accept the creation of Iraq. We accept the creation of Jordan. But we don't accept the creation of that Jewish homeland because the Jews have no place, some would say at all, and definitely not in the Middle East. And so rejection of Balfour is exactly what we're seeing today, undermining that right of the Jewish people to self-determination and rejecting the basic idea that when Balfour was given, that was already the implementation of that two-state solution, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The later changes Resolution 181, the partition plan, which the Arabs rejected. We have to just remember that the Arabs were given the opportunity to change the mandate. Just I saw one of the questions earlier on that popped up. Just in two words, maybe, or two sentences, the legal basis. Balfour was the abstract declaration. Once it was accepted and adopted by the international community in San Remo, that gave it a much wider legal force. Once it was then adopted into the mandate for Palestine, that was really the last decision made by the international community of what would happen with this piece of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The partition plan in 1947 had the potential to then change that already agreed decision to create a Jewish homeland in those boundaries. It was the Arab countries who rejected it, and they've remained in that rejection to a greater or less greater extent to this day. I just want to mention in 1951, or just after the Israel's independence war, there was a tri-country committee set up to try and mediate between the parties. And when you read this UN document, you see unbelievable things there. You see, for example, that Israel had suggested to the international community that Israel in the armistice line borders, more or less, become the borders of the state of Israel. Why do I say more or less? Because Israel had even offered to incorporate Gaza with all of its Arab population, giving them equal citizenship into the new Jewish state. The Arabs, on the other hand, said, we're not prepared to accept that offer until Israel agrees to commit national suicide by allowing the 700,000 so-called Palestinian refugees to return to Palestine. Now, why do I say so-called Palestinian refugees? Because there is no reference only to Arabs as being refugees from Palestine. That doesn't exist. It's a complete oxymoron. Palestine at the time was made up of Jews and of Arabs. As we said before, already by 1929, there were 150,000 Jews here. There's the famous video of Golda Meir, where she's explaining on BBC how she herself is a Palestinian. She held a Palestinian passport. So when you're talking about Palestinian refugees, and you're only singling out the idea of the Arab refugees, that is in of itself a rejection of that idea of this national homeland for the Jewish indigenous population that already by then had been living in Israel for 150 years almost, and had really grown in size over that entire period. And when you then single out Israel as the only creation of that period, which you refer to as a colonialist enterprise, then that's something which really undermines Balfour, undermines the idea of Balfour, which is the recognition of the right to self-determination of the Jewish people. And that's something which has continued on, driven first and foremost by Arab violence towards Jews, which then influenced world opinions and then tried to make a change using violence to achieve their goals. That's something which sadly to this day hasn't really changed. And it's something that we see on a constant basis.
No, that's absolutely right. The themes laid down by Balfour, as you point out, continue to play out, continue to resonate. And frankly, thank God that at least we Israelis understand the consequences of giving in, so to speak, of acquiescing to Arab objections, which would be, as you put it, national suicide. And last time I looked, we weren't too interested in doing that. But it is something that the rest of the world seems to, it's not that they're wishing us to commit suicide, but they're not connecting the dots. They're not really understanding the quid pro quos and the implications of what the Arabs are saying that they really want, which is tantamount to our disappearing. And And as you point out, that is something that started with Balfour and continues to this day. Maurice, you really very helpful in pointing that out and laying that out. I greatly appreciate it. I'm sure everyone on the call appreciates it as well. I want to thank you, and I want to now turn this over. I think it's to Irving, is that right? To take us to the next step.
Thanks very much, Doug.
Thank you, Maurice and Doug. It's now my pleasure to introduce Itamar Marcus. Itamar founded Palestinian Media Watch in 1996 and has filled the role of director for 25 years. He is one of the foremost authorities on Palestinian ideology, policy, and propaganda. He travels the world speaking to members of Congress, Parliament, and governments, exposing the hate and terror promoted by the Palestinian Authority. These meetings and the reports he has presented have led to 4 countries cutting off all funding to the PA and several others reducing such funding. But the funding does go on. Itamar, we have seen over the last 2 decades or more that most of the legacy media, newspapers across North America and Europe, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Times of London, the Daily Mail, as well as cable news like CNN, CNBC, ABC, CBC, BBC, have shown what is either a total ignorance of the reality in Israel and Gaza, or an incredible bias against Israel. At times, it even seems that the media is waging a proxy war against Israel. Itamar, you've worked over 2 decades monitoring the Palestinian media since you created Palestinian Media Watch. In our discussion last week, it became apparent that the Palestinian Arab media is not only biased, but is the fountain of bias from which the world media is drinking. A veritable propaganda machine. Please tell us more about what you have uncovered over these last 2 decades and what we need to bring to the attention of the public, particularly in the Western democracies.
Thank you very much, Irving, and thank you, Goldi, for putting this together, and all my old friends who are here. It's great to see you, Andrew, Thomas, and everyone. And of course, Maurice, who I see every day. What you're saying is correct, and this is what I want to talk about today, is how the Palestinian Authority sees Balfour and how that impacts on the entire world narrative about Israel, because it's absolutely true that the way that the Palestinian Authority has defined Balfour and what happened afterward and why it happened is the basic message that's sort of the foundation of the international media's demonization and undermining Israel. Now, what I want to do is share my screen, and I want to show you some quotes from Palestinian sources, some videos, and you can all follow along on this PowerPoint presentation. Okay, the title is, "Had there been no Balfour Declaration, the PA would have had to invent it." Now that sounds very strange at first glance. We've just heard how incredibly important Balfour Declaration is for Israel. What do I mean that the PA would have had to invent it? And to do this, what I want to do is take a look at, this year was the 104th anniversary of Balfour. I want to take a look at how did Israel mark the 104th anniversary and how did the Palestinian Authority mark the 144th anniversary. Now, I would think, considering how important this is for Israel, how it led, it was really, we've heard it from these speakers previously, how it was the foundation that led to San Remo and to the League of Nations and the UN. It's really the first international step that led to the creation of the State of Israel. You would think Israel had fantastic celebrations, and the PA, I would assume, would be really minimizing this. And I just want to show you, from my perspective, I want to show you how Israel celebrated the Balfour Declaration. Okay, there you go. An empty box. There was nothing about this incredible event of Israeli history. Now, like I said, the Palestinians, you wouldn't expect to want to celebrate this or educate about this. because for them, it's recognizing Israel's rights. Now, I'm going to show you what the Palestinians did, and then we'll have to try to figure out why it's so important for them. Okay, the PA's marking of the 104th anniversary of the Palestinian, of the Balfour Declaration was literally an entire national festivities about this, or I would say national mourning about this. And I want to show you a couple of posts from the Ministry of Education to show you this is happening in the school system, right in the Palestinian school system. These are posts from the Palestinian Ministry of Education. The schools in Palestine are marking the anniversary of the wretched Balfour Promise while directing activities, directed activities while persisting in conscious adherence. So there are directed activities. And these are some of the posts that were on the Ministry of Education. The Balfour Promise, a false promise. The right of return is legitimate. The 104 years since the wretched promise. No to the theft of the homeland. Here you have the Balfour Promise will fall, theft of the homeland. No to the wretched promise. These are all different schools in the Palestinian Authority. Your promise will fall and our right will triumph. Palestine is ours and does not belong to the Jews. Here's another one. A national home for the Jews on the land of Palestine. The right is ours. The cursed Balfour Declaration. Palestine is ours and will not be a homeland for the Jews. So the entire PA, and here's another example, all of these from the Ministry of Education in different Palestinian schools. And here's one final example, and there are many, many more that I'm not showing you. And this is every year. If you would ask any Palestinian child, what year are we up to since the Balfour Declaration? They would all in 1 second say 104 years. If you ask Israeli children how many years since the Balfour Declaration, I fear many of the Israelis would say Balfour who? It's that little, it's that minimized within Israel. We can discuss that also at the end. But basically, I want to go first into the Palestinians. Why is the Palestinian Authority focusing on this event that we just heard is so detrimental to them and has been? Okay, so here is, I'm going to take you through Palestinian Authority ideology and show you how the Balfour Declaration is necessary for the Palestinians to create their ideology. Now, axiom 1 of Palestinian ideology is that Palestinians have a 6,000 or more year old history in the land. Axiom 2 is that the Jews have no history, not in Jerusalem, not in the land of Israel. Therefore, Israel has no right to exist. Okay? Palestinians have thousands of years of history. The Jews have no history. Now, I want to just play a little part of one video that was on TV a little while ago. This is the most important religious figure in the PA. He's Abbas's advisor on Islam. And listen to him express this message that I just gave to you.
حوالي 6000 سنة من اليوم كان الوجود العربي الفلسطيني الكنعاني في أرض فلسطين. المشروع الصهيوني مشروع قائم على إفراغ أرض فلسطين لتغدو فلسطين أرضا بلا شعب ليستقدم لها شعب بين قوسين إذا صح أن نسميه شعبا بلا أرض بلا وطن.
If it can be called a people, the Palestinians don't recognize that the Jewish people are even a people. They're willing to say that we have, that we're a religion sometimes. The end of his talk, he says the Jews who have no connection to the East or to Palestine or to the Semitic race, if we treat it as an issue. So here he's saying Palestine belongs to them 6,000 years. The Jews were never here. These are the two axioms on which they base their entire ideology. Now, this left them with a problem. There are right now millions of Jews in Israel. The Palestinian Authority had to explain to their people, why did Jews come here? If we have no history and no connection, why did Jews, many of them leaving the comfortable lives in Europe, comfortable lives in the West, why did we come if we have no history? And this is where Balfour comes in, and this is what their answer is. The way to explain Israel's existence is they say that Israel is the result of colonialism. And because there is a Balfour Declaration, they can say, you see, that's the proof. They have no period here, they have no history here, but it was a colonial implant. Now, there's a very special kind of colonialism, because usually colonialism was sending its people out to take over a land for its wealth. The Palestinian definition of colonialism is quite different. It has a couple of components. One, the Jews are so evil that non-Jewish world cannot live with them. Therefore, they kept expelling Jews from one place to the next. And finally, they decided to solve the problem once and for all, steal Palestine from the Arabs and send all the Jews there. The Palestinian message is that stealing Palestine by the colonialists was not a regular colonial implant. It was for the purpose of solving their Jewish problem. Now, I want to show you this in their own words. This is a documentary that appeared on Fatah and Palestinian TV many, many times in many, many different years.
أمام مؤامرات اليهود طاقت أوروبا بوصفهم وأوصافهم واحتكارهم وفسادهم وتسلطهم وتسلقهم لأعمدة السلطة وأساسات الدولة. في العام 90 و200 وألف أصدر الملك إدوارد الأول قراراً بطرد اليهود، وتبعته فرنسا وألمانيا والنمسا وهولندا وتشيكوسلوفاكيا وإسبانيا وإيطاليا، وأحست الشعوب الأوروبية بأنها نكبت بإيواء اليهود. اليهود مرة أخرى ينتزعون وعد بلفور وأوروبا ترى فيه حلاً أمثلاً.
The Europe couldn't bear the character traits of the Jews, their corruption, their climbing up, etc., etc. And Balfour was going to solve the problem as an ideal solution to getting rid of the Jews. I'm going to show you how early in Palestinian Authority ideology this is. This is from 1998, which means just after the PA was formed. Look what appeared in their official newspaper. The difference between Hitler and Balfour was simple. Hitler did not have colonies to send the Jews, so he destroyed them, whereas Balfour turned Palestine into a colony and sent the Jews. Balfour is Hitler with colonies. Hitler is Balfour without colonies. They both wanted to get rid of the Jews. Zionism was crucial to the defense of the West by ridding Europe of the burden of its Jews. So here you have the reason, the motivation. The Jews are these evil people. And it wasn't just in 1998. I want to show you November 1st. This year, the same message in the official Palestinian newspaper. Tomorrow is the anniversary of Balfour. In that period, they were only believers of the Jewish religion. Again, denying the Jewish nationhood. They were only Jews by religion. But the Europeans wanted to get rid of the Jews and convinced the Zionist movement would serve their purpose, and they would get rid of the Jewish problem in Europe and would ensure their colonial interests in the Near East and the Far East. So again here, the Balfour Declaration was to get rid of the Jews. It's all based on a vicious anti-Semitism. They go so far in their rewriting of history, and this is Mahmoud al-Habash again. This is the Abbas's advisor on Islam, and look what he said. History has proven the Islamic ownership of the Western Wall. No person besides Muslims ever used it as a place of worship throughout all of history until the ominous Balfour Declaration. Now, this sentence is so important in terms of understanding the Palestinian mindset. What they're saying here is, we say, and in fact, the Balfour Declaration recognized all of Jewish history and therefore the rights to the land. What they're saying is Jewish history in the land started with the Balfour Declaration. No one prayed at the Western Wall. No one cared about the land of Israel. There was no such thing. It was Palestine, but it was the Balfour Declaration which turned the Jewish people into a people and started Jewish history in the land. And there are many more examples. I won't read all of them, but they talk about it as they invented the Jewish people with the Balfour Declaration. It was a complicated act of fabrication. The project included establishing a national homeland for the Jewish people, which was just invented. Again, it's a fascinating idea. The Jewish people didn't exist before Balfour, and Balfour is what turned the Jewish people, the Jewish religion, into a people. I just want to show you, it's coming from the top as well. This is Mahmoud Abbas. Talking about the Balfour Declaration a few years, talks about a historical injustice, the ominous Balfour. We call it the government of Britain to bear its historical and moral responsibility and not mark and celebrate the 100th anniversary. This is a general message of the PA. And actually on the 100th anniversary, there was intense demonization of Britain. This was the Prime Minister, Theresa May. This is one of, you see here, she has the Star of David and the skull and crossbars here. This was a very, very vicious period of demonization, not just of Israel, but of Britain as well. Now, so why is Balfour so important for the Palestinians? Palestinian Authority has no real history. They have to explain why the Jews are here. Balfour is a missing link in PA ideology. It's the only historical event in PA history that is actually it has any value for them. The real history of the Jewish people has no value for them. They have no history to talk about. So they harp on this historical event of the Balfour Declaration, and it's the key for their denying Israel's existence, Israel's right to exist as a people. Now, Palestinian Authority 2021, look how active. I started off by showing you examples from the PA schools. I want to show you that every year they're doing more and more about the Balfour Declaration. So for example, for the first time in history, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas enacted today a presidential decree ordering the national flag to be flown at half-mast on November 2nd, each year marking the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. So from now on, it is an official day of mourning in the Palestinian Authority. They had marches and demonstrations. They had posters. This one I thought was one of the fascinating ones. I'll show it to you. This poster here, Balfour, your promise unjustly killed my son due to his resistance to the occupation whose basis is you. So her son was a terrorist, attacked Israelis, was killed, and she's complaining to Balfour because he created Israel, which turned her son into a terrorist, which of course she calls a resistance. I want to show you that from the old people you see there, I want to show you a young girl who was on the Facebook page of the Fatah youth movement. This is how she was presenting Balfour, and you see again how they're embedding this in the minds of young children.
الشاعرة الصغيرة ميار أحمد عزات ملحم من الصف الخامس. سوف أتكلم لكم عن قصة وعد بلفور. بلفور صهيوني الفكر، إنجليزي الجنسية، أعطى فلسطين للصهيونية وهو لا يملكها، وكذلك اليهود لا يملكونها بأي حق شرعي يا بشر أو قانوني. أعطى هذا الوعد المشؤوم لقد ظلم الشعب.
And she ends with the words, the blood of its martyrs and its resolve until achieving its Palestinian state on all the soil of Holy Palestine. There's something that's so critical to understand here by the Palestinians harping on Balfour. To the international community, they say that they're concerned with Israeli control of what they call the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Jerusalem. Here it's clear they're not upset with what happened in 1967. They're upset with Israel's existence. They're denying Israel's right to exist in any borders. And that's why this is so critical. And that's why this has to be stressed. They do not accept Israel in any borders. And that's what this little girl is saying here. They don't have a legal right, and we will eventually have a Palestinian state on all the soil of Holy Palestine. That's the message that Palestinian children are growing up on. I want to show you how beyond Balfour, I want to show you a fantastic example of this message that appeared on Palestinian TV earlier this year. It doesn't mention Balfour, but it mentions the ideology which is a result of the seeing Balfour as the beginning of the Jewish connection to the land.
السهل الساحلي الفلسطيني هو وجه فلسطين نحو البحر المتوسط والعالم العربي ونقطة احتكاك حضاري بين الشرق والغرب، ويمثل بوابة فلسطين للعالم. يمتد الساحل الفلسطيني من جبل الكرمل شمالاً إلى رفح على الحدود المصرية جنوباً، ويقع بين المرتفعات الجبلية الفلسطينية شرقاً والبحر الأبيض المتوسط غرباً. فيه العديد من الموانئ مثل ميناء حيفا وعكا ويافا وأسدود وعسقلان وغزة، وقد توافدت عليه مختلفة عبر العصور طمعاً للاستفادة من موقعه، وما زال الساحل الفلسطيني تحت الاحتلال.
This was a children's program, official Palestinian TV, going up and down the coast of Israel, Haifa, Akko, Yafa, Ashdod, Ashkelon. All of it is occupied Palestine since 1948. And again, it's because of this Balfour-focused message. Israel has no right to exist. Israel is a colonial implant. And of course, that's the reason why all the Palestinian maps look like this. Sometimes they have the flag, sometimes they don't. This is from a Palestinian school book. This is defined as the geographic area of the Palestinian state. There is no recognition of Israel. Now, the fourth axiom of the Palestinian Authority is the following. Because of all this, because Israel has no right to exist, because it was the Balfour Declaration that created them, because the Palestinians have the history, destroying Israel remains the Palestinian need for justice to undo the injustice of Balfour, and the conflict will continue until Israel is destroyed. And this was very prominent this year. I'll give you just a couple of examples to show how, to their own people, they openly say that the goal is Israel's destruction and not ruling Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. It's all of Israel. Here's one of the examples. This is in the official newspaper, the irregular columnist. The world is still incapable of correcting this historical mistake, this severe injustice, and putting an end to the colonialist Zionist project. It will not, after 104 years, the conflict is continuing and will not stop until this promise and its consequences are canceled. Official newspaper, the end of the colonialist, and that's the key word, colonialist, connected to Balfour, colonialist Zionist project. The war will go on until Israel is destroyed. Here's another, this is an item that they had on TV about Jewish immigration, and it ends with the identical message. It's dealing with Balfour and everything else. History has never let the colonialists remain, and the occupiers have always left in the end. One day they, the Jews, too, will return to where they came from. All of these are all in the last month on PATV. And I'll finally play this last item for you, where he again talks about the terrible Balfour Declaration and undoing the Balfour Declaration.
أن نطالب المجتمع الدولي وأحرار العالم أن يقفوا معنا من أجل استرداد حقنا في هذه الأرض المغتصبة التي اغتصبت عام 1917 بوعد بلفور المشؤوم، وأيضا النكبة 15/5/1948. نؤكد جميعنا أننا ما زلنا متمترسون في هذه الأرض المغتصبة وأننا سنقدم دماءنا.
Blood and the blood of his children and the families for the sake of the homeland. This is the Fatah senior official from Clinton. So to sum up the message here, and this is what's so critical, the PA has transformed the Balfour Declaration from recognizing thousands of years of Jewish history into the starting point of Jewish history in the land. Without Balfour, the PA would have no hook to anchor its lies and demonization of Zionism. They turned this hook, and they've turned this, as you see, into a national day of mourning from now on. As every single child knows, Balfour, the colonialist, the head of a colony, created the colony Israel. And that's why I say, had there been no Balfour Declaration, the PA would have had to invent it. They'd have to invent something to try to prove that Israel and the Jews are a foreign implant. The final thing is to get back to where we started in the original question. The international media today has adopted this Palestinian Authority message, hook, line, and sinker. Why does the international community accept Palestinian terror, accept their glorifying terror, paying salaries to terror, naming schools after terrorists? Because they have bought the lie that the Palestinians are heroic victims of colonialism and therefore have the right to fight and kill Israelis in order to liberate the land. They have bought this message. And that's the great tragedy. What we have to do is work with the international community, show them that Jewish history did not start with Balfour. We do have the history in the land. It was the Palestinian history, which is really just a drop in the bucket of history, a couple of years of history, and let them get their history straight. For the Palestinians, Balfour is the key to all their terror, and for the world media who've adopted this, it's their key to supporting them. We have to fight this. Thank you.
Thank you, Itamar. We have an enormous counter-propaganda effort in front of us. Some of this material is unbelievable, especially since these are the peace partners of Oslo. And we have Jewish organizations who continue to support this. I now pass you back to Goldi Steiner, who will introduce our next panelist.
Dan, nice seeing you again. And I would like to address you, first of all, Dan Illouz is ZOA, the Zionist Organization of America's representative in Israel. He previously worked as a close advisor to various politicians, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and now Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. He is a McGill-educated lawyer specializing in international law and a former member of the Jerusalem City Council. Question to you, Dan. Due to the widespread incitement of anti-Zionism practiced in academia, where ideology has taken hold of our educational system, we cannot stress enough its damaging implications, poisoning innocent young student minds who will occupy leadership positions and will elect the next leaders. Please give the audience an example of what we can do, whether there are legal implications, legal powers that can change the rhetoric, how can we neutralize or turn around this vicious trend. I would like to give you one example of what happened at the London School of Economics, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. In the United Nations Sweetwater Valley, the U.S. Israeli ambassador has been harassed and chased out of the event. What tools can you provide for our audience to stand up against such harassment?
So first of all, thank you so much, Goldi. Thank you, Irving, and thank you all of the people organizing this. And this is really a wonderful event. I feel like I have big shoes to fill, speaking all of the wonderful panelists. So I'll try to do my best. Unlike the previous panelists that really focused on the Balfour Declaration, in this talk, we're going to focus about delegitimization as a whole on campuses. And Goldi, thank you for the example also that you gave. I'm going to try to share a lot more examples. I think that we all know that there is a problem in campuses in America, in Europe, and all around the world. But it's good to actually see a lot of examples of what is happening on campuses in order to understand how big of a problem it is. With your permission, I'm going to take a few minutes to try and share my presentation. So I call the presentation Academia's War on Israel's Legitimacy. And what I want to do is 4 things in this presentation. First of all, I want to speak about students that are attacked on campus for either being Jewish or for being pro-Israel. Then the second thing I want to speak about is about professors in the academia that support BDS and what that does to pro-Israel students. The third thing is Israeli professors and how they are also a part of the problem and how that also works. And then I'll try to answer Goldi's question as to what are some of the tools that we have in order to make a difference. When we'll get to that, we'll speak about that also more in detail. So first, we'll speak about the students being attacked on campus. And what I'm trying to really ask is, are universities in America a safe place for Jews? Now, you don't only have to ask me, because people actually asked the students, the Jewish students in America, how they felt and whether they felt safe on campuses in America. And in a poll that was made not so long ago, September 21st, 2021, 65% of the respondents said that they felt unsafe on campus due to anti-Semitic attacks, with 1 in 10 reporting that they have feared physical assault because they are openly Jewish. These are crazy numbers. This is a situation which is very, very not good. Sorry for it. It's a very bad situation. And I want to try to show you 2 examples of things that happened on campuses around America in the last few months that show you the type of things that scare the Jewish students. So this is one example. In City University of New York, CUNY, you had, let me show the video and then I'll explain what you've seen.
I hate your shirt. Shit. I'm gonna set it on fire. No, I'm serious. Bring it.
So there you see someone, a student in CUNY, that wore an Israel Defense Forces shirt, like I used to wear in college, and like a lot of people wear because they're proud of the Israel Defense Forces. And you have one pro-Palestinian student that goes to them with a lighter and tells them that they're going to burn their shirt. A very violent thing to do. Now, some people claim that she was just joking or something like that. It's definitely something that's scary and that a student in a safe place shouldn't be going through. I want to show you guys another example that actually got to physical violence. This happened in the University of New Mexico.
Ronnie Sappenar is a UNM freshman. He's also Jewish and from Israel. He was wearing this shirt last week that says, "Just Jew it."
It was a really funny shirt. A lot of people liked it. It was like my icebreaker, and it's always a fun time, but I guess that night it wasn't.
As you can see from the bruises in these pictures, the fun didn't last long. Sappenar was attacked and suffered multiple injuries.
They checked me, they did CAT scans, and they came to the conclusion that I had internal bleeding, that I'm probably concussed, and they said that my bruising is going to stay for a while, especially on my face. Right now it looks a lot better on the camera, but it was a lot worse from the beginning.
According to this police report, Sappenar was not only attacked by a group of guys, they stole his Apple Watch and Air Max shoes, but it didn't stop there. Sappenar says they yelled anti-Semitic slurs and continued to beat him. That's why he says it's a hate crime.
So here we have an example of an actual physical attack against a shirt that says "Just Jew it," a fun shirt that says "Just Jew it." And now these are maybe a little bit more extreme examples which actually got to violence or a threat of violence, but the very atmosphere on campuses is very problematic for students. Student governments all around America have tried to pass BDS resolutions. I can tell you that ZOA, the organization I represent, helped in UC Davis, UC Santa Barbara, Arizona State University, and many other places to veto such resolutions, but there are attempts all around America. Now, I want to ask you, how does a student who is a pro-Israel student, who is a Jewish student, how does he feel when his student government that's supposed to be representing him decides to I don't know of any pro-Israel student that asks for a resolution that the university should outwardly support Judea and Samaria or things like that, because we understand that things that are politically not accepted politically, then we don't want to make other students uncomfortable or things like that, or not to be divisive. But here you see that the other side doesn't care. They don't care. They bring up divisive resolutions, and they make really students feel uncomfortable. And that's part of what makes really students feel uncomfortable on campuses all around America nowadays. But it's not only students. We also have professors that use their role and their classroom in order to promote their ideas. And I'm going to show a lot of different examples now, and I'm going to go through them rather quickly, but they're important examples. For example, in Columbia University, one of the more problematic universities in America, you have 40 different professors that signed a pro-BDS petition. Again, I want to ask you, a student that sits in this class, if we're talking about a pro-Israel student, do you think he will feel comfortable speaking his mind when his professor signs a pro-BDS petition? And if we're talking about a student that's just uneducated about the conflict, when he sees this professor, which is someone he respects, he wants to get knowledge from, who signs a pro-BDS petition, what is the message that he gets? He gets a pro-BDS message, and then he gets convinced by these things. One other example was in the Boston University department. They wanted to hire an anti-Israel postdoctorate associate, and there was a lot of protest against that. And actually, the protest had an effect and an impact. And Boston University said that they won't hire that associate. The problem is that afterwards, news reports showed that while they weren't accepted in a specific department, they were accepted in another department. So this is another example of people with very anti-Israel views being accepted in top positions. You have here a New York University department that on the one hand co-sponsors anti-Israel speakers, but on the other hand, they reject a request of a pro-Israel group to host a pro-Israel speaker. Double standards, something that we know very well when it comes to Israel, so it exists also on campuses and educational establishments. You also have, again, we're back in Columbia, a tenured professor that proudly supports terrorism against Israel. I want to read a quote that he said, that he wrote, sorry. The only thing standing in its way is what he means is in Israel's way. He speaks in what he wrote about how bad Israel is, and then the only thing standing in its way is the ongoing Palestinian resistance to Israeli settler colonialism and racism that continues inside Israel and Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza. The ongoing marches of return in Gaza and the armed resistance of the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades to Israeli invasion in Gaza. This is a support of terrorism. This is what it is. Izzadin al-Qassam is a terrorist group. And this professor, Joseph Massad, comes out in support of the terrorist group. You see also in the picture an anti-Israel apartheid wall. Of course, I'm saying how all of these things make it very difficult for students to feel comfortable in campuses around America nowadays. I do want to say a little note of optimism that here you have an article by Eugene Kontorovich, something that a person that I think everyone in the panel at least knows and that we very much appreciate. He had an initiative to get academics to actually sign a letter against BDS, and he has 600 scholars who actually did that. So there are a lot of positive people. It's not everyone that's in the academia that is negative, but the tone that students get and the fear that they have when they're in a class by someone who really outwardly supports the killing of the Jews, Izzadin al-Qassam is a terrorist group, is something that really students have to deal with today. Now, I want to speak about an extra part of the puzzle, which is Israeli professors. Israeli professors are 100% part of the problem. One of the great organizations that deals with this problem is one of the organizations that's partnering with this program. Doug is representing it here. So shout out to you, Doug, and to Im Tirtzu. You guys do an incredible work. And I'm actually going to use some of their content in order to show you what Israeli students have to go through. And then I want to speak a little bit of how that affects academia worldwide. I'm sorry, I used Hebrew, but I'm going to translate. You have 3 different cases here. Again, this is taken from Im Tirtzu's website. On the bottom, you have a website in English. It didn't have this exact content, so I took the Hebrew content, but you have a website in English that speaks about many cases of where Israeli academics support BDS. So you have here 3 examples. The first example on the right, I'll start on the right because it's in Hebrew, so it's from right to left. The first example on the right is of recently in 2018, while there was an operation in Gaza, a professor decided to not teach on that day in order to show solidarity with the Gaza people. In other words, I want everyone to understand and to make it clear. We're in an Israeli public university. Tel Aviv University is an Israeli public university, publicly funded, 100%, everything is public about it. And an academic over there decides not to teach in order to show his solidarity with our enemies while we're fighting a war against it during an operation in Gaza, something that's completely insane. Another example in the middle, I'll actually go to the left, to the example on the left first, and then I'll get to the middle. We're talking about a professor that told a student that came in uniform to class, to a lecture, he told him he spoke to him very impolitely. And when the student asked, "Why are you speaking to me impolitely?" he said, "Well, you came in uniform, therefore I'm speaking to you accordingly." In other words, he told him that he doesn't approve of the uniform he's wearing. I want to remind you that in Israel, everyone joins the army. The army is mandatory service. Everyone joins the army. We're very proud to join the army, right? But here you have a student that was in Miluim, in reserve duty, who came to university while he was in service in order to not miss his class. And instead of his professor applauding him for his service, he's getting yelled at by his professor for coming to class in uniform. Now, the third one in the middle speaks a little bit about the problem that this gives us internationally. And I'll say what it says in the middle, and then I'll speak about it more in general. There was the anthropologist organization of Europe that decided to boycott it. Now, when they looked a little bit deeper into that, they realized that the part of the people that tried to push this forward were actually Israeli anthropologists, Israeli academics that asked their European counterparts to boycott Judea and Samaria. To be fair, they didn't boycott all of Israel, they boycotted Judea and Samaria, but to me, it's just as bad. And so you have some Israeli professors asking their European counterpart, please boycott our country. Now, this is a good example of the influence that Israeli academics have internationally and in the academia in general. Imagine these types of professors that are very far left, that go to conferences all around the world, that also become visiting professors. I can tell you that as a law student in McGill, the one Israeli professor that came to be a visiting professor in my law school, I don't want to say his name, maybe I should, but I don't want to say his name, he taught a class on the legal sides of dealing with terrorism. And one of the things that he said is that attacking Israeli soldiers is not considered terrorism because they're soldiers. Now, I can understand that an academic in Europe or something like that would try and make this argument. But for an Israeli to make this argument is very shocking to me. It was shocking to me as a student. He came and he made and he gave some of the arguments that end up being the arguments that people hear from Israelis, and they end up being very convincing because they come from Israelis. And not only do his counterparts hear this from Israelis, also the students and the next generation of academics also hear it. And you have this far left vision, which is actually ingrained in the next generation of elites all around the world. And that's a very big problem. So now I want to speak about the tools that we have. I don't want to be pessimistic, but the tools that we have aren't plentiful. We don't have many tools. The academia is a very big problem, but we do have some tools. I want to speak about two tools. One is a legal tool that is being used in the past few years in order to, in the States, I'm talking about in the States specifically, in order to try and fight discrimination against pro-Israeli students or against Jews. And the other one is a more positive tool. So the legal tool that we have is called Title VI. It's a tool that we use a lot at ZOA in order to try and help some of the students that are attacked in campuses all around America. Title VI says basically that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to the discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So anything that which is federally financed, which is most of the campuses in America, of the relevant campuses in America, any place that is federally financed cannot discriminate. And the last few years, thanks to the Trump administration, actually, then the Jewish and anti-Semitism was considered a discrimination against a national origin or a race. And therefore, now the door is opened to try and fight anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias on campus through Title VI. Now, having said that, as I said, in ZOA, we try to use this a lot. We have a center which is called the ZOA Center for Law and Justice, which is led by a wonderful lawyer called Susan Tuckman, and she does an amazing work. But having said that, there is a difficulty with that because while there is the possibility to ask for recourse there, one case, for example, against Rutgers University has been sitting at the Office for Civil Rights for more than 10 years. And so we see that the process is very slow. When you're speaking about 10 years for something that happens on campus, think about where these students are 10 years later and how motivated they are to keep on fighting the fight of what happens on campus. It's a problem, but it's still something which we can use and which is a tool which is positive, which is good to use. The second thing I think we should use is very similar to what actually Itamar said when it comes to international relations. In order to fight the lies, what we need to do is to try and use all the tools that we have in order to put forward the truth. And that can be through different fellowships. It can definitely be through webinars like this one, which was full of facts and full of incredible information, but it also needs to be focused to students in the academia. And it can be through different fellowships, scholarships, trips to Israel, but that's definitely something that we should try and do in a more sustained way in order to give the tools to the students so that even if they're given all of these lies by all of their professors and fellow students and things like that, they'll know the facts and they'll know how to fight them. So this was my presentation, and I'm actually, I know that I didn't give any magic solution, Goldi. It's a difficult situation, and I don't think that there is a magic solution. But with many of the things that we're dealing with in Israel, we need to have patience and we need to keep on fighting the good fight. In this case, with facts and with very good information, and hopefully over time, while we stay strong, then we'll be able to win this fight also.
Dan, this is Doug. Before I turn it back to Goldi, you were kind enough to reference what Im Tirtzu is doing. Im Tirtzu actually exists because of anti-Israel sentiment in Israeli academia. And a lot of people in the United States are shocked to learn about the degree of anti-Zionism that exists in the state of Israel itself, largely housed in campuses. One of the things that we have done when you talk about what do you do about it is we created a website called Know Your Professor, which is basically like a course guide that features, if you're thinking about taking a course in economics with so-and-so, you ought to know that he or she signed a petition supporting the boycott of their own institution. Just so that you know when you walk into the classroom what you're dealing with. There are over 100 professors on that website. It has been looked at by hundreds of thousands of times. It has become a very valuable and valued course guide. But you're right that this is, there's so much that suffuses Israeli academia. If your career is flagging in Israel, go abroad, start bashing Israel, and it will be a major shot in the arm to your academic career.
If I can say one thing about what you just said, if in America we saw that it has become illegal to discriminate against the Jewish state or against to be anti-Semitic on campus and to discriminate against pro-Israel students and things like that, in Israel, I'm not sure it's a big problem. I mean, of course, whenever something like that happens, it shocks people in Israel and then they protest it. But there is very little legal recourse. And I think that legislation should be put forward in order to punish professors in publicly funded institutions. Again, I'm very for academic freedom to the extreme, and I'm for free speech even to the extreme. But when we're talking about publicly funded institutions,
correct,
then there should be a degree of that they shouldn't be able to pass. That's my personal opinion, at least.
Anyhow, we have very little time left before I pass the word to Irving. I want to thank each and every one of you in order of appearance. Doug, Andrew, Maurice, Itamar, Dan. Did I leave anybody out?
Tomas.
So thank you. We're very grateful for what you've done today for us, and we look forward to further guidance from you, what we can do. Our aim is to debunk the occupation and other lies and stand up to the powers and make a difference. With that, I pass the word to Irving for his closing remarks.
Well, first, I'd like to reiterate our thanks to all the panelists and the moderators. We have so much work to do. And we do have some things in the works. A little too early to talk about them, but there will be an organization called truthmustbetold.org. The website is not up yet, but we will also be focusing together with the Ben Zimra Foundation on these issues. To the participants, thank you so much for spending a couple of hours with us. We hope that you will come away from this webinar with a clear understanding of what Israel is facing on a daily basis, a continuing barrage and battle for legitimacy against an enormous propaganda machine driven by Islamists and funded by both Muslim and Western governments. Most critical, as Goldi mentioned, is a situation in academia poisoning the minds of young students. Students who will not only be the future electorate in our democracies, but also our future leaders. We ask you to share the knowledge you have gained here, because knowledge is power. Our communities need to understand the situation better than they do in order to feel comfortable supporting Israel in the face of Arab propaganda that is today center stage. Our mission at Israel's Legal Rights, apart from webinars, consists of educating youth, grassroots, and the public at large the world over. For more in-depth information about our legal rights, we have a concise book authored by the late Solomon Ben Zimra called The Jewish People's Rights to the Land of Israel. Available in paperback on Amazon. If you agree with what we do and want to help us, please extend us your financial assistance. No amount is too little, no amount is too large. To donate, please go to our webpage at israelslegalrights.org, not .com, but .org, O-R-G, and click on the Donate tab. Or you can mail us a check. Information will be up on the screen in a moment. And if you stay a minute longer, David Stambler, our beloved webinar guru, will be showing a link to the video where we ask the government of Israel to declare Yom San Remo a national holiday in order that Israelis themselves will become more acquainted with Yom San Remo and the Balfour Declaration and the Jewish people's rights to the land of Israel. Thank you again for joining us.
Once again, thank you one and all. Thank you, David. Thank you, Agnes. And we look forward to more guidance and more information from you, the panelists.
On behalf of InterSue, I want to thank all the panelists. Terrific job, very insightful. And Goldi, as always, you and Irving put together a terrific, terrific program that really does great credit to the mission of CILR, and we all look forward to doing many, many more of these. It's a great zchut for the people of Israel, for Am Yisrael, and keep going from strength to strength.
Amen ve amen.